what else? I mean, that's their whole business model. In fact, they're trying to reorganize American constitutional jurisprudence and the rule of law around the idea that the entire executive branch serves one guy. That's the unitary executive theory, that this is all about serving whatever Donald Trump wants. So yeah, I can't imagine what other interests they have in mind.
One of the things we did see were a number of pictures of former President Bill Clinton with Jeffrey Epstein, with Ghislaine Maxwell in a jacuzzi, swimming in a pool. How do you explain that connection, and are you comfortable with it?
I mean, I have no idea. This is why we want to get to the bottom of it and get all of the facts out to, to the public. I mean, that's what this is about. And, look, there are clearly lots of people that are in photographs with Jeffrey Epstein, and in addition to being a child.
So you want to watch something burn? And let me light the match, because what we just witnessed in that clip is nothing less than the complete architecture of authoritarian power being assembled right before our eyes. And Jamie Raskin just pulled back the curtain on something so profoundly dangerous that it should shake every single person who believes in the proposition that no one stands above the law. But wait, there's more. Because this is not simply about Jeffrey Epstein, or even about the Department of Justice. This is about the systematic reconstruction of American democracy into an instrument of personal power for one man, and the legal theory undergirding this entire rotten edifice is something you need to understand viscerally in your bones, because it is the blueprint for dictatorship, dressed up in constitutional language. Just days ago, Raskin and his colleague Robert Garcia declared that Donald Trump and the Department of Justice are violating federal law as they continue covering up facts about Jeffrey Epstein's international sex trafficking ring, even as they give star treatment to Epstein's convicted co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell. And the absolute contempt for accountability here should ignite a fire in your chest, because this is not bureaucratic delay. This is calculated obstruction. Raskin made clear that it's Donald Trump making the call here for whatever reason. And when you pair that with Raskin's statement that this is all about covering up things that Donald Trump doesn't want to go public either, about himself or members of his family, friends, or the social business cultural network he was involved in, you're looking at something that goes far beyond scandal into the realm of systematic corruption of the entire justice apparatus. And here's where it gets absolutely nuclear, because the partial release violated U.S. law by failing to meet the December 19 deadline, and at least 550 pages of documents were released entirely blacked out. 550 pages of nothing but government-sanctioned darkness. And when at least 15 files disappeared from the Justice Department's website, including one showing a photo of Trump, we moved from cover-up into Orwellian memory holing in real time. But let's connect the dots here, because Raskin in that clip was not just complaining about redactions. He was diagnosing the disease at the heart of this administration. And the disease has a name. It's called unitary executive theory. And you heard him say it, their whole business model is reorganize American constitutional jurisprudence around the idea that the entire executive branch serves one guy. And this should terrify you, because Trump's second administration is testing the unitary executive theory, which asserts that the president has unlimited power to control the actions of the 4 million people who make up the executive branch, and if courts uphold arguments based on this theory, it would give Trump and subsequent president unprecedented power to remove and replace any federal employee and impose their will on every decision in every agency. Think about what that means when you're talking about Epstein files. Think about what that means when every single federal prosecutor, every FBI agent, every inspector general serves at the pleasure and whim of one individual who can fire them for refusing to do his political bidding. This theory, which is a fancy way of saying that a chief executive can rule over the executive branch like a monarch, means that every one of its millions of employees serves at the president's beck and call. And we are watching this play out right now in real time, because more than 100 prosecutors and career lawyers have resigned from the DOJ since Trump returned to office, with many citing political interference, pressure to drop cases involving Trump's allies, and threats of retaliation for refusing unethical orders. This is not normal Democratic backsliding. This is a purge. This is the transformation of the Department of Justice from an institution devoted to the rule of law into what one former White House ethics counsel called a system where political enemies are punished and allies protected, like what happens in Putin's Russia. And here's where the Epstein files become not just a scandal about elite pedophilia and sex trafficking, but a test case for whether Trump can successfully weaponize the entire federal law enforcement apparatus to protect himself, and that question was answered when Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, who previously served as Trump's personal defense attorney, said there's no effort to hold anything back because of Trump's name, but also said they're not redacting the names of famous men and women associated with Epstein, except of course they are, because telephone records from the investigation included in the materials are heavily redacted, and you cannot see who was calling whom and when. The New York Times reported that Trump appeared only a small number of times in the released files, with the documents appearing to focus heavily on Clinton. You don't need a doctorate in political science to understand what's happening here. The Justice Department under Pam Bondi, who was confirmed to do Trump's bidding, has systematically violated the Epstein Files Transparency Act, which was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. The law, which Trump reluctantly signed, set a deadline that the department simply defied because in Trump's legal universe, laws are for other people. Laws are suggestions that apply to the little people, while the president and his cronies operate in a zone of impunity. Recent indictments of former FBI Director James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James, after direct pressure from the president, have crossed a red line, according to journalist Emily Bazelon, who called this an utter dismantling of all the norms and rules enacted after Watergate, to have separation between the White House's political aspirations and the Justice Department. And let me tell you what Watergate was about. Watergate was about a president who believed he was above the law, and the entire post-Watergate constitutional architecture was built to prevent exactly this moment we're living through right now. Public reports estimate that since 2022, Trump has issued more than 100 threats to investigate, prosecute, imprison, or otherwise punish his perceived opponents, and Bondi's memo promising quarterly reports to the White House on a weaponization working group represents a blatant attempt to undermine the principle of insulating the department's legal judgments from improper personal or partisan considerations. 100 threats to prosecute political enemies, and we're supposed to believe that the massive redactions in the Epstein files, the disappearing documents, the defiance of congressional deadlines, that all of this is just about protecting victims. Give me a break, because there's a draft indictment from the first Epstein case that implicates other rich and powerful men who knew about or participated in the abuse, and there are witness interviews between the FBI and people accused of being at Epstein's rape island that need to be released, but they won't be released because the unitary executive has decided what serves his interests. This is what authoritarianism looks like in a democracy that still has the forms and procedures of democratic governance. You still get hearings, you still get press conferences, you still get official statements about protecting victims, but the substance has been hollowed out and replaced with loyalty to the leader. And look at how this connects to Trump's broader constitutional power grab, because through the unlawful firing of National Labor Relations Board members and executive orders, Trump is trying to eliminate the independence of independent regulatory agencies as part of his undisguised effort to effectuate a radical dismantling of our checks and balances system, going hand in hand with his efforts to reshape the civil service, Praetorianize the military, and staff the administration, from top to bottom, based on personal fealty rather than qualifications. Personal fealty, that's the phrase that should echo in your mind, because that's what unitary executive theory produces in practice. It produces a government where the only qualification that matters is loyalty to Trump, where career prosecutors who refuse to drop politically motivated cases get forced out, where top officials demand names of thousands of FBI agents who investigated the Capitol riot and order the dismissal of criminal cases like the one against New York Mayor Eric Adams for political reasons, while the Attorney General's chief of staff says prosecutors who refuse the dismissal order have no place at DOJ, no place at the Department of Justice for people who believe in prosecutorial independence, no place for people who think that the law should apply equally, no place for anyone who won't bend the knee. And when you watch that clip of Raskin talking about Bill Clinton's photographs with Epstein, you're watching something brilliantly strategic on Raskin's part, because he's refusing to play defense. He's saying yes, absolutely, investigate Clinton, investigate everyone who was involved in Epstein's network, release all the files, release all the names, because the progressive position here is transparency and accountability across the board, regardless of party affiliation. But that's not what this administration wants, because the so-called Epstein files have become a political lightning rod for the Trump administration, which has faced criticism from lawmakers in both parties on the issue. And Trump understands that real transparency would expose his own connections, his own history with Epstein, the social network that bound them together for years. Congressman Ro Khanna, who sponsored the Epstein Transparency Act, said he did it because people kept telling him they were upset about this Epstein class of people who got to do whatever they want and had enormous power and needed to be exposed, and that populist energy, that demand for elite accountability, is something that cuts across traditional partisan lines, which is why you had figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene saying, The whole point was not to protect the politically exposed individuals and government officials. That's exactly what drain the swamp actually means. Expose them all, the rich, powerful elites who are corrupt and commit crimes, not redact their names and protect them. Even the MAGA right is furious about this. Even the people who worship Trump are looking at these redactions and feeling betrayed because they were promised accountability. They were promised that the swamp would be drained, and instead what they're getting is the swamp being fortified and militarized in service of protecting the king. The intellectual architecture of this authoritarianism matters because it's not just crude power, it's power rationalized through legal theory and the unitary executive theory formed by conservative legal theorists in the 1980s to help Reagan roll back liberal policies, promises to radically expand presidential power by claiming that whatever the federal government does that is executive in nature, the president alone should personally control, meaning total control over the entire executive branch with its millions of employees. This theory emerged from the Federalist Society, from Heritage Foundation blueprints from decades of right-wing legal engineering, designed to concentrate power, and since taking office, Trump has expanded control over executive branch agencies, ordering many to target his political opponents, while his administration has asserted a constitutional right to control and even cease enforcement of federal law, which legal experts described as claiming a constitutional power to immunize private parties to commit otherwise illegal acts with impunity. Read that again: immunize private parties to commit otherwise illegal acts with impunity. That is the logical endpoint of unitary executive theory, taken to its natural conclusion, which is that the president decides who the law applies to and who gets to operate outside it. And when you apply that framework to the Epstein files, when you understand that Trump believes he has the constitutional authority to determine what gets disclosed and what gets buried, then every redacted page, every disappeared file, every violation of the Transparency Act becomes not a scandal, but the system working exactly as designed, a system where power protects power, where elite networks of exploitation remain hidden, where the president serves as the ultimate arbiter of what justice means. Attorney General Pam Bondi released binders called the Epstein Files Phase 1 that included details previously released and suggested during a Fox News interview that a full client list was sitting on her desk. But months later, we're still waiting because that list, if it exists, threatens the architecture of power that Trump sits atop, and Democrats raise the question of whether the White House has moved to prevent declassification of the full Epstein files because they implicate Trump, and whether massive redaction efforts were intended to shield him. And the answer is staring us in the face. Yes, obviously, yes, that is exactly what's happening, and the mechanism by which it's happening is this legal theory that says the president controls everything. When Raskin talks about reorganizing American constitutional jurisprudence, he's talking about a fundamental reordering of how power operates in this country, because the Constitution created a system of separated powers with checks and balances, specifically to prevent any one person or branch from accumulating too much authority. With the backdrop of the Supreme Court's decision granting Trump absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for core official functions and Project 2025's blueprint for autocratic government, Trump is positioning himself to change the balance of power by increasing presidential authority over all aspects of the executive branch, and the unitary executive paradigm would elevate the executive above the legislative branch by saying the president has complete command and control over the executive branch. Complete command and complete control: a president who can fire anyone, who can direct prosecutions, who can bury evidence, who can immunize allies, who can weaponize the full force of federal law enforcement against enemies. And you want to know what we call that system in other countries? We call it authoritarianism, we call it autocracy, we call it the death of Republican government. The fact that failure to release the full unclassified Epstein files as defined in legislation would violate the law which required the Justice Department to publicly post documents within 30 days. And given the strong bipartisan backing of the bill, some Republicans have made clear they see a partial release as a violation, with Representative Thomas Massie saying there was no ambiguity with the law, and what the law requires tells you that this is not some gray area, this is black-letter law, being openly defied, and the defiance is the point, because every time Trump breaks a norm, violates a statute, ignores a deadline, and gets away with it, he's expanding the boundaries of what's possible. He's testing whether anyone will stop him, and so far the answer has been no. The Supreme Court, the observers and scholars believe Trump's actions have intentionally invited cases by which he hopes the judiciary will embrace unitary executive theory and permit him to do even more, and the current Supreme Court appears ready to grant that wish. Is a court he has shaped through 3 appointments, a court that has already granted him sweeping immunity from prosecution, a court that has systematically dismantled the administrative state and regulatory capacity, and if this court formally endorses the most expansive version of unitary executive theory, then we will have completed the constitutional transformation from a republic of laws to an empire of one man's will disguised in originalist rhetoric about what the founders supposedly intended. Except, of course, the founders designed the entire system specifically to prevent consolidation of executive power, specifically to ensure that ambition would counteract ambition. But here we are, and about 4,000 of the DOJ's more than 115,000 employees have resigned, and more than 200 have been fired, and that exodus is not random. Those are people who understand what's happening, people who see the politicization and cannot in good conscience participate, people who value their professional integrity more than their jobs, and their departure creates space for loyalists, for people willing to carry out orders that violate norms and laws, for people whose only qualification is fealty to Trump. And that's how authoritarian capture of institutions works. You don't have to fire everyone, you just have to fire enough people loudly enough that everyone else understands what's expected of them. You create a climate of fear and compliance where the people who remain either actively embrace the authoritarian project or keep their heads down and follow orders. The Epstein case is the perfect vehicle for this transformation, because it involves such heinous crimes, such profound elite corruption, such legitimate public outrage that Trump can present himself as the accountability president, the one willing to take on the powerful, even as he systematically protects the powerful, even as he buries evidence, even as he defies the law, because the way the Trump administration has handled the Epstein files, including downplaying information for much of the year, means this likely won't be the end of the story, and Democrats have used the files as one of the few levers of power they have. While before returning to office, Trump and key figures vowed to release the files as proof that a cabal of child predators was being protected by the government and working to undermine Trump. But now some of Trump's base believes he himself is part of the cover-up. And they're right to believe that, because Trump's name is virtually non-existent in recent batch of files with just a few pictures of him, with women, and a framed photo of Epstein, with a redacted woman showing a $22,500 oversized check signed by Trump, while Clinton's image appears everywhere, and that selective disclosure is not accident, it's strategy, it's weaponization of information to serve political ends, and when at least 15 files disappeared from the Justice Department's website, including one that showed a photo of Trump in an open drawer with Trump, Epstein, and Maxwell together, the cover-up became undeniable, became literal digital erasure of evidence from government servers. This is why Raskin's analysis in that clip matters so much, because he's not just complaining about corruption, he's identifying the systemic transformation, he's showing how the Epstein cover-up is downstream from the unitary executive theory, is downstream from the broader constitutional crisis, is downstream from Trump's belief articulated in his own words, that he has an Article 2 where he has the right to do whatever he wants as president, whatever he wants, including burying evidence of crimes committed by members of his social network, including defying laws passed by Congress, including transforming the Department of Justice into his personal law firm. Justice Department lawyers, including the Attorney General, are the people's lawyers, not the president's lawyers, and they have a sacred duty to enforce our nation's laws without prejudice, and with an eye toward justice, and the DOJ must be seen as fair and independent arbiters, but Trump's appearance at the DOJ calling out his appointees and personal lawyers will further tarnish public trust and undermine democracy. We're in a moment where the rule of law itself is at stake, where the principle that no one stands above the law is being tested like never before in modern American history, and the test is failing because Ernest Hemingway's description of bankruptcy as occurring gradually and then suddenly applies to Trump's assault on the integrity of the Justice Department, as during Trump's first term, he chipped away at independence bit by bit over 4 years. But in the first few months of Trump's second term, administration smashed through remaining barriers, stalking FBI and DOJ leadership, with loyalists firing civil servants, abandoning prosecution of allies, and threatening politicized investigations of enemies. Gradually, then suddenly, and now we're in the suddenly phase, where the demolition is happening at breakneck speed, where career prosecutors are resigning rather than follow illegal orders, where files disappear from government websites, where laws are violated openly and with impunity, where the president demands prosecution of his enemies and protection of his friends, and the machinery of justice grinds along in service of power. The connection between the Epstein files and the broader authoritarian project could not be more clear, because both rest on the same foundation, which is that powerful men should not be held accountable, that elite networks of corruption and exploitation should remain hidden, that the law is a weapon to be deployed against enemies and a shield to protect allies, and that the president has the constitutional authority to make all these decisions unilaterally, without oversight, without accountability, without constraint. Implementing Project 2025 would push against norms of DOJ independence by undoing many existing norms and consequently undermining the rule of law, while the proposals prioritize political agendas over the independence and impartiality of law enforcement, thereby posing risks to democratic norms. Every redaction in those files, every disappeared document, every violated deadline, every defiant statement from DOJ officials is a brick in the wall of authoritarianism that's being constructed, and we're watching it happen in real time with full awareness, and the question is, what do we do about it? Because Democratic Representative Ro Khanna, who co-authored the Transparency Act, said the release does not comply with the law, and he's considering steps including impeachment, contempt proceedings, or criminal referral, and he and Massey are drafting articles of impeachment and inherent contempt against Bondi. But will those mechanisms work in a system where the entire executive branch has been reorganized to serve one guy, where unitary executive theory provides constitutional cover for lawlessness, where the Supreme Court stands ready to bless ever more expansive claims of presidential power? This is the crisis Raskin is identifying. This is the nightmare scenario that political scientists and constitutional scholars have been warning about for years, the transformation of American democracy into competitive authoritarianism, where elections still happen, but where the instruments of state power serve partisan ends, where laws apply selectively, where accountability exists only for the powerless, and the question is whether institutions are strong enough to resist pressure from an authoritarian leader in a second term, where he faces fewer constraints in Congress and a more effective and compliant staff and bureaucracy, given the expectation that there won't be people stopping Trump from doing things that would violate the Constitution or the law. The guardrails are gone, the adults in the room have been purged, the internal resistance has been crushed, and what remains is the raw exercise of power cloaked in the legitimacy of legal theory, justified by claims about the unitary executive, sanctified by courts that have been captured by the same ideological movement that produced this theory in the first place, and the Epstein files in all their grotesque horror become just another tool in the authoritarian toolkit, another lever of power, another mechanism of control, another test of how much the public will tolerate, how much corruption will accept, how much lawlessness will endure before we say enough. The survivors deserve justice, the co-conspirators must be held accountable, the American people deserve transparency, and we're getting none of it, because the system has been hijacked, because the president believes he can do whatever he wants, because unitary executive theory provides intellectual cover for authoritarian practice, and because every institution that might stop this, every check that might balance this power, has been weakened or captured or cowed into submission, and Raskin is standing there pointing at the machinery, showing us exactly how it works, explaining the constitutional theory undergirding the corruption, demanding that we understand this is not normal, this is not acceptable, this is the dismantling of Republican government before our eyes. So when you watch that clip, understand you're watching someone sound the alarm. Understand that the Epstein cover-up is not separate from the broader authoritarian project. It is the authoritarian project in microcosm. It is elite impunity. It is the weaponization of justice. It is the death of accountability. It is the triumph of power over law. And it is all made possible by a legal theory that says the president is essentially a king, with absolute control over the executive branch. And if we don't organize, if we don't resist, if we don't fight back with every institutional and extra-institutional tool available, then this is just the beginning. Then the Epstein files become a precedent for unlimited presidential power to bury evidence, to protect allies, to persecute enemies, to operate above and beyond the law. And American democracy as we've known it dies not with a bang but with redactions, with disappeared files, with violated deadlines, with the gradual then sudden transformation of justice into another instrument of authoritarian control. And we cannot let that happen. We will not let that happen because too much is at stake, because the rule of law matters, because accountability matters, because justice matters, and because the alternative is unthinkable.